Hello, everybody. Our clock is going crazy up there. So I have no idea. But according to my watch, we're just, and now Siri thinks I'm talking to her. But anyway, we're ready. So, all right. So welcome, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started for our class. I hope you guys all had a good weekend. Whoever left me the M&M chocolate bar, I appreciate with the little nice note about getting well. That was the best gift that anyone could ever give me. So that was great. So thank you to whoever did that. I really appreciate it. So today I want us to try and remember on Thursday you're going to read Willa Cather, or you will have it read. Willa Cather's Death Comes to the Archbishop. So we'll spend most of our class on Thursday talking about that. And I'd like today to be our final day that we talk about the colonial frontier. And in particular, I want to pick up where we left off last week by looking at James Fenimore Cooper and the last of the Mohicans. So I want to just give you a bit of a background about who Cooper was and what he was trying to do. So I put his dates up on the board over here. James Fenimore Cooper was born in 1789, and he passes away in 1851. So he is alive during what we call the Jacksonian period of American history, and really is one of the definitive characters of that period, certainly one of the great figures of his time. We remember him mostly for the books that he wrote. He wrote 32 novels as well as 3 books of political analysis. In fact, some people have argued that his political analysis in some of his books, one's called The American Democrat, rivals what de Tocqueville wrote in Democracy in America. I still think Democracy in America is a much more important book, but it does say something about Cooper, that he was so interested in the politics of his day. And he was a consul for a while in France. So he served in a diplomatic mission and had all kinds of political appointments during his life. Cooper was born into a very large family. So his father was William Cooper, who was the founder of Cooperstown, New York, home of baseball and other things. So that Cooperstown is his father's town. When James Fenimore is born, he's born into that town when it's still roughly a wilderness. And people often argued, he was number 12 of 13 kids. People often argued that it showed very plainly that he was raised on the frontier, and I think that matters for what he tries to get across in his novels. As a young man, he went into the Navy and did extremely well. He was considered officer material, probably high officer material, but his wife kind of forced him out of the Navy because she didn't want to be married to someone who was gone so often, and so he relented and gave in to his wife's demands on this. Quit the Navy. He ended up writing a history of the Navy, which is still regarded as the best history of colonial and revolutionary Navy that exists. But he did maintain that love of the Navy for a long time. But afterwards, after he leaves the Navy, he has to figure out a way to make an income. And his brothers have done all kinds of crazy stuff. Many of them have died. So even though he's number 12 of 13, he ends up inheriting the estate from his father, because all of his brothers either went off and did something stupid or ended up in prison. And they were interesting people, as you can imagine, pretty wild family. And Cooper has no idea how to pay for his father's estate. So when he inherits it, about 1811, after he leaves the Navy, a young man still, he decides, mostly by talking to his wife, that he wants to write fiction. And he spends roughly the next 10 years working on a novel. And his first novel is a failure. But then his second novel, which was set in the American Revolution and is a historical romance called The Spy, did incredibly well. And it was marketed all over the United States. It ended up being sold in Europe and doing well. It was about a spy in George Washington's army during the Revolution. And so Cooper gets this taste of success, and he recognizes that if he's going to be a writer, he needs his writing to be something important. And so he really dwells on the idea of what would an American writer look like. So if we had an American letters, if we had some kind of American fiction, what would that look like? So he decides that as he's thinking about what the American character and what the American novel would be, that the only thing that really represents America completely is the frontier. The South, because of slavery, will never be representative of America, he says, obviously anticipating the 1619 project and dismissing it early on. But certainly he thought that the South would never be representative of this. But he also thought that probably the Yankee from New England wouldn't be that representative either, not because they're anti-slavery, but simply because there's such a particular way of Puritan life and the remnants of Puritan life that there's something lodged in the New England mind that is final and is set there and probably won't change much. And so he says, well, if it's not a Southerner and if it's not a Yankee, then it has to be something else. And the only thing that really leaves, because he's no longer concerned with the oceans since he's left the Navy, he thinks that the only thing that really matters is the West. And so the West becomes, for him, this great homogenizing feature. And Cooper really defines himself by his relationship to the frontier, and he comes up with a set of characters for 5 separate novels. So he writes this series, and the series is called the Leatherstocking series. And they have a number of different names, but he writes 5 different ones, all about this character, Natty Bumppo, who is a fascinating guy because, and this is very important for Cooper as he's trying to figure out the ultimate American character, Natty Bumppo's parents are very poor English. So they're indentured servants. When they get to America, they're killed by Indians. But then it's not a completely anti-Indian story because Natty is then raised by a local tribe called the Mohicans. And they themselves were Christianized Indians. So you get this kind of interesting mix of class and religion all going on at once in Natty Bumppo. And Bumppo becomes this kind of symbol of the lower class English struggle to make something on the frontier. So the frontier becomes not just the place of Americanization, it becomes the place where all people, whoever they are, regardless of where they come from, regardless of their background, regardless of their skin color, which is very important for Cooper as well, all of this becomes unimportant on the frontier. All we know is that these things contribute to the development of the American character, but it is the frontier that makes the character. And his vision of the frontier, though it can be extremely violent, and we saw that in the clip that we watched on Thursday last week, though it can be extremely violent, his frontier is also very open and idyllic in a lot of ways. So there was a theory that we talked about a little bit when we talked about Republican mythology, if you guys remember all the way back to the first day of class. And we talked about the Republican myth being one in which God gives the Europeans the frontier to remake them, but not to remake them as anything, but to allow them to live as essentially Roman republicans with all this free space. So rather than it being an aristocratic republic, it will be a freeholder republic in which every person owns a certain amount of land, and therefore every person is responsible not just for that land, but for the cultivation and the stewardship of that land. And they become something for the whole family as well. So you may have this representative head of kind of the king of the castle, but you also have all these other people who are dependent upon that person, and therefore there's this kind of trickle-down effect in which everybody becomes a small property owner in America. Jefferson thought that, as he talked about this, that the frontier was seemingly limitless. That is, there was never really a boundary to that frontier, but it would take over 1,000 years, if you remember, Jefferson said, to reach St. Louis. And he's completely wrong about this. He's so wrong, it's absurd. But regardless, even though he gets that wrong, that idea becomes such an important idea to the frontier, that the frontier, the American frontier especially, is this place of unlimited boundaries. And so here you take someone like Natty, who's genetically English, from lower class, but he's raised by American Indians, and by American Indians who have been Christianized, and therefore he becomes the kind of idealized figure. And so there are 3 characters that really mattered for Cooper, especially in his most famous of these novels called The Last of the Mohicans. So there are quite a few characters, and I'm going to go through these. So hopefully, if I go too fast, just stop me. But we have Natty, who's our main character. Natty Bumppo, sometimes he's called Hawkeye, sometimes he's called the Deer Slayer, sometimes he's called Killdeer because that's the name of his rifle. Sometimes he's the Long Rifle, sometimes he's the Long Carabine. So he has a number of different names, but Leatherstocking is the name that we usually give to the 5 novels that are based on this. He then has a brother, so don't get too confused by the movie. The movie makes this his dad, but in the novels it's his brother. His brother is the last, or will be the last, of the Mohicans, a man by the name of Chingachgook. And then there's his son, the one who gets killed in the movie, Uncas. So these are the 3 main characters, Natty, Chingachgook, and Uncas in The Last of the Mohicans. So Chingachgook and Uncas are actually American Indian. They're not white at all, but they're raised in the same tribe. So they're all part of this Christianized Indian tribe, the Mohicans. Yeah.
And Uncas is Chingu's son, right?
Yeah, in the novel, he's the son. Right, I'm sorry, he did that in the movie too. I'm getting the two confused. But yes, he's his son. He's Chingachgook's son, but Natty is kind of more than an uncle. So Chingachgook and Natty are brothers of the same age. When The Last of the Mohicans takes place, they're in their early 40s, and Uncas is around 20. He's a young man who's coming of age at that point. So they then encounter these other characters who are trying to escape the frontier. So you've got Natty and Chingachgook and Uncas, and really the best way to think of them, you guys will have to forgive me for bringing in more modern literature than this, but basically these guys are rangers. They're Aragorn. Right? They run through the forest. As I told you guys, my dissertation advisor used to make fun of Last of the Mohicans. He called it Terminator of the Appalachians. So, but there's this high octane adventure story. There's no question about it. And Natty and Chingachgook and Uncas spend their time ranging the frontier and protecting people and sending messages, especially back and forth between the militias, the various militias, colonial militias, and the English army. They're representative then of both the American and the English armies at the time. Part of what Cooper is trying to do, though, is give us a distinction between what an American would look like versus what a Brit would look like. And all of The Last of the Mohicans takes place in 1 year during the Great War for Empire, the French and Indian War. It all takes place in 1757. So these 3 characters, let me get I'm back. These 3 characters are then encountered, or they encounter and save 4 characters who also are very interesting and represent different things to the story. They run into a young woman named Cora, her sister Alice, and then with them is a Southerner. In the movie, they make him British, but he's a Southerner named Hayward. And then there's an evangelical pastor by the name of David. And so the story revolves around these 7, around Natty, Chingachgook, Uncas, Cora, Alice, Hayward, and David. And they each represent something different. So Cora, as I mentioned the other day, every time we get any kind of glimpse of her at all in the novel, and Cooper's got this kind of wild story. If any of you take my Jacksonian class, I'll actually assign this novel that we read, Last of the Mohicans, together in it. And I thought very seriously about assigning it to you this time, but I decided to go with Death Comes and do 2 Cather novels rather than this. But it was a real toss-up, and because this novel's great. But I generally find that students who've not read The Last of the Mohicans, it takes them about 50 pages to get into it and to get the style down, because Cooper is writing for a European audience, not for an American audience. And part of what he's trying to do is explain what the frontier looks like in the same way that you might get a travel guide today when you go to Europe and you get all the descriptions, what you should visit, what you should not. So the novel is as much a travel guide as it is anything else. And the novels of Natty Bumppo were wildly popular. In fact, you guys will give me a moment, I'll get my notes on this, because I want to make sure that I get this right. How many different publishers there were attempting to capitalize on his popularity. So this is, But you don't have to write this down, but just know that this is a lot. In France, there were 18 different publishers vying with each other to publish the book. In the German states, there were 30 different publishers, and there were translations in Russian, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Turkish, Persian, Farsi, right, and Egyptian. It was just a wild-selling novel, especially The Last of the Mohicans. And even, so this has been a long time now, but when I lived in Europe, I lived in Austria from 1987 to 1988. It was my sophomore year of college. And even then for Halloween, they don't dress up as cowboy and Indian. They dress up as Chingachgook and Natty. I don't know if that's still the case, but that's what it was back in the late 80s. So pretty interesting how long this image had stayed. And for those of you who've taken World War I, you may remember that when the United States lands as Allied troops in World War I, the telegram that goes across all of Europe through the Allied forces is that the spirit of Leatherstocking has awoken. Right? And that meant, of course, that America has arrived. Pretty amazing, really, when you think about how powerful this story is. So anyway, Chingachgook, Natty, and Uncas run into Cora, Alice, Hayward, and David. All of these four are trying to escape from one fort to another. And that's, in the movie, I gave you just a little bit of the reality of what was going on, because the French and Indian War, this was at the low point of the British effort during the French and Indian War, right after the scene that you saw at Fort William Henry, which was a huge French victory over the English in upstate New York. I mean, absolutely pivotal victory. It was after that the government in Britain collapses, and then you get a new government that comes in and establishes itself as an extremely pro-British force in terms of British military force elsewhere. And they'll change the entire strategy of the war, and it becomes a war that really is based in North America rather than in other places. So what the government in Britain has to do is it has to make a decision. Does it want to put all of its resources behind efforts to save, say, places like the West Indies or India, or do they want to put their resources behind the American colonists? And the new government that comes in 1758, for those of you who take American founding next semester, you'll hear all this again, so I apologize. But this changes everything, because the new government that comes in says, yes, we're going to protect American settlement, we're going to protect the American frontier, we're going to do what we can to, and that it reverses everything once we come to that. And that's where Edmund Burke arises out of this, and all kinds of things that we don't need to get into in this class. But these four are trying to escape and to get from one place to another. Now, let me just explain who each of these persons are. So as I mentioned, every time Cora is ever brought up, right, back when I started talking about the kind of writing style that Cooper uses, she is always described as dusky. She's described as dark. Her tresses always hang far into her eyes. She has, however, this incredible nobility about her, and she is capable of doing almost anything on the frontier that Natty can do. So Cora is in every way his equal. In the story, Uncas falls in love with Cora, and that becomes, it's not Natty and Cora, but Uncas and Cora fall in love with each other, and it becomes a kind of forbidden romance that goes on within the story. But what we find out later on, into about the middle of the story, we find out that the reason that Cora is always described, and it starts getting tedious after a while. The dark, dusky Cora arrives on the scene, and she says certain things, and they're always very good things, and she does the right thing. But the description starts getting a little old. We find out why. We find out that her father had a relationship with a West Indian woman. He was Scottish. Monroe is their last name. And that's all based on a quasi-true story. But he had an affair with a native woman in the West Indies who was black, and they had this daughter, Cora, and then Colonel Monroe took the daughter back to Scotland and raised her as her own. Now, as his own daughter. I want you to just think about this for a moment. You have the heroine of the story in 1826 is half black. And of course, what does that mean in the American culture of the time? She's black, right? And that's an amazing thing to think about for a moment, that Cooper would go this far that he would actually have the heroine of the story be a black woman is astounding. And it tells us a lot about what Cooper is trying to get at. And his argument, not in any kind of modern politically correct way, but his argument is that the frontier assimilates everybody, and it brings the best out of us. It can also bring terrible things out of us, this violence, but usually the violence is for good. But for those of you who've had a chance to read the novel, you know that Cora is actually the real heroine of the story. At the end of the story, she gives herself up as a sacrifice in that tribal fire that you saw briefly, the scene from. She's the one who actually burns in the fire in the story. And she gives herself up so that the others can live. Natty should have given himself up, but the problem was James Fenimore Cooper wrote the novels out of order, so that he had a novel, his first novel about Natty Bumppo, Natty's about 80. So when he goes back and he writes about Natty when he's 40, he has to have Natty survive because he's already in the next novel. And so he makes up this kind of terrible line, actually. It's a great story, don't get me wrong. But Natty makes this point, why aren't you the one sacrificing yourself? If you're the hero, well, he says, if I sacrifice myself today, who would I save tomorrow? So therefore, I have to be alive because I still have people to save. It doesn't quite work, but it's just the fiction of the story, right? The way the story happened. But this is what Colonel Monroe says as he's talking to Hayward. Hayward, as I said, is a Southerner. And very importantly, he can't get into his mind, and this is one of his great failings, he's from an aristocratic Southern family, and he can't get it into his mind that he himself has to do the dirty work on the frontier because he's so used to others doing labor for him. So he's a great guy, he's liberally educated, he talks often of Cicero, he talks of Horace, he has all of the liberal education down, but he's a slave master. And that's his great flaw, that he is not a full human because he's degraded other humans. And he falls in love with Alice. I told you there are all these relationships going on. And so he approaches Colonel Monroe, who's his superior officer, and says, may I have your daughter's hand in marriage? Monroe gets confused because he thinks anybody who knows my daughters would want to marry Cora, not Alice. I mean, poor Alice, right? Alice is always described as kind of fumbling. She's very, very sweet, and she's very, very nice. But she really can't do anything on the frontier. Everything has to be taken care of for her in the way that she's described. She's kind of frivolous, and she's light, and she's a wonderful character, but she doesn't have real substance in the way Cora does. And when Hayward corrects Monroe and says, no, I'm asking for your daughter Alice's hand in marriage, Monroe explodes. Like, how dare you? How dare you judge my oldest daughter because of the color of her skin? Again, for an 1826 novel, this is astounding, and I'll read a little bit of it. He says, I had seen many regions and had shed much blood in different lands before duty called me to the islands of the West Indies. There it was my lot to form a connection with one whom in time would become my wife. She was the mother of Cora. She was the daughter of a gentleman of those isles, by a lady whose misfortune it was, if you will, said the old man now proudly to Hayward, to be descended from that unfortunate class of people who are so basely enslaved to administer to the wants of a luxurious people. This is the curse entailed on Scotland by her unnatural union with a foreign and trading people. But could I find a man among any man who would dare to reflect on my child, he would feel the full weight of his father's anger. Ha, Major Hayward, you yourself were born of the South. These unfortunate beings are considered to be a race inferior to your own. 'Tis most unfortunately true, sir, said Duncan Hayward, unable any longer to prevent his eyes from sinking to the floor in embarrassment. And you cast it on my child as a reproach? You scorn to mingle the bloods of the Haywards with one so degraded, lovely and virtuous though she may be? Fiercely demanded the jealous parent. Heaven protect me from prejudice so unworthy of my reason, returned Duncan, at the same time conscious of such a feeling, as deeply rooted as it was engrafted in his nature. For the sweetness and the beauty and the witchery of your younger daughter, Colonel Monroe, might explain my motives, rather than imputing to me this injustice about your older daughter. And it goes on for a few pages, but this is where we learn, halfway through the novel, why Cora is always described as dark and dusky, because of who her mother is. And so she's really the half-sister of Alice. So You've got Uncas and Cora falling in love with each other. You have Alice and Hayward falling in love with each other as they're all moving across the frontier and trying to figure out where everything fits in. This guy, David, is absolutely fascinating. David is presented in the way that a medieval comedy would have presented a fool. He's essentially God's fool, which means he's very wise, even though he looks very stupid. So he would be, I'm drawing a blank in Shakespeare, in the play that the Academy did last year. It was so good. Anybody remember? Twelfth Night. Yes. And who's the hilarious character in there?
Fest.
What's his name?
Fest.
Yes. Right. So this is who David is in this story. So David is this character who everywhere he goes, he's always quoting scripture. Right? No matter what you talk about with him, his response is always to quote scripture. And when they're in the middle of the Indian battle, he starts singing at the loudest he can sing, and he always sings a psalm. So even when they're trying to be stealthy going through the forest, David will suddenly break out into evangelical song. And everybody's going, David, stop. You've got to stop now. And he keeps saying to them, no, you don't understand. My song is one of protection. And if the Indians are pagan, they'll miss us. My song covers us. It covers the multitude of who we are. And you never quite know in the novel if James Fenimore Cooper is serious or not. Because it does turn out that way, that in fact the Indians think David is so crazy that they don't want to kill him because they're fearful of his spirit. So there is something to what he's doing that actually works out. And James Fenimore Cooper really plays with these ideas of, all right, what would this evangelical on the frontier be like? Right? What would he do? What would his response be? And David makes it out alive of everyone. So Cora and Uncas don't make it out of the story. They're killed. But David makes it out alive. And he does so to go on and preach. So let me read to you just a little bit from one of the other novels of this series. This one is from the Pioneers, and it was written in 1823. It was the first of the stories. It's the one where Natty and Chingachgook are now in their 80s, early 80s, and they're looking back on their life and what they had done. And this is how Cooper describes the state of New York. He says, near the center of the state of New York lies an extensive district of country whose surface is a succession of hills and dales. It sounds kind of nice, doesn't it? Or, so to speak, with greater deference to geographical definitions of mountains and valleys. It is among these hills that the Delaware takes its rise, and flowing from the limpid lakes and thousand springs of the region, the numerous sources of the Susquehanna meander through the valleys until, uniting their streams, they form one of the proudest rivers of the United States. The mountains are generally arable to the top, although instances are not wanting where the sides are jutted with rock that aid greatly in giving to the country that romantic and picturesque character which it so eminently possesses. The vales are narrow, they're rich, and they're cultivated, and a stream uniformly winds through each. Beautiful and thriving villages are found interspersed along the margins of the small lakes, or situated at those points of the streams which are very favorable for manufacturing. And neat and comfortable farms, with every indication of wealth about them, are scattered profusely throughout these vales and even to the mountaintops themselves. Roads diverge in every direction from the even and graceful bottoms of the valleys to the most rugged and intricate passes of the hills, and academies and minor edifices of learning meet the eye of the stranger at every few miles as he winds his way through an uneven territory, and the places for the worship of God abound with that frequency which characterize a moral and reflecting people. And the variety of exterior and canonical government which flows from unfettered liberty, and especially liberty of conscience. In short, the whole district is hourly exhibiting how much can be done in even a rugged country and with a severe climate, under the domain of mild laws, where every man feels a direct interest in the prosperity of his republic, of which he knows himself to form a part. The expedients of the pioneers who first broke ground in this settlement of this country are succeeded by the permanent improvements of the yeoman, and intend to leave his remains to molder under the sod where he tills, or perhaps of the son who, born in this land, piously wishes to linger around the grave of his father, only 40 years have passed since this territory was itself the wilderness. Now, I apologize, that was kind of long, but it gives us this very idyllic look of what the frontier is. The frontier is this place given to us by God to remake Eden, to make what we need to do, and to create this republic that will then be the beacon to all republics that will ever exist. But the republic itself will not be aristocratic. It has aristocratic institutions. Notice these edifices of liberal learning are everywhere. And it has churches. But those churches are more for establishing kind of the equality of man than the inequality of man. And this is how Cooper writes constantly, that we have this sense of this idealism, this idyllic nature that allows us to do these various things. So this is what I want to get at with Cooper, and I probably spent more time on it than I should. But I want you to recognize that this really is, The Last of the Mohicans really is the first great American novel, in the sense that it's the first novel that really asks the question, what is the American? And his answer is the American is the frontiersman. And not just any frontiersman, but a frontiersman who is part English, part Indian, part Christian, has all of these things kind of melded together, and does everything possible, short of actually giving his life, but does everything possible to serve as a heroic ranger on the frontier. That's this element. And so again, don't forget how wildly popular he is in Europe, right? With all those publishers vying, and then that thing from World War I. So, okay, any questions on Last of the Mohicans? Hopefully you at least have a good sense of the story. I really would recommend it, and the Audible version is very good as well. Yeah?
Why is it called Last of the Mohicans?
Okay, so I didn't know how much detail to go into on all of this, but in the story, and there's a large mythology. I mean, really, it's a mythology worthy of, well, it's worthy of Hiawatha, and it's worthy of say, the Kalevala and some of the other mythologies of the 19th century. So the mythology behind The Last of the Mohicans is that there were, in the east of North America, two great tribes vying with one another. One was the Iroquois Confederacy, which is also called Magua. Magua means evil snake people. And that's, so if you remember the bad guy in the movie, he represents all of the Iroquois. He's actually not an Iroquois. He was, I can't remember what tribe he was. He was from a neighboring tribe of the Iroquois, and the Iroquois adopt him after he had been an alcoholic and had been beaten as a bad soldier. He'd been beaten for discipline for being an alcoholic and for doing something stupid when he was drunk. He had been beaten by Colonel Monroe. That's why he has this death wish for all of Monroe's children. So in the past, there had been two equal tribes, the Iroquois and the Delaware. And one of the sub-tribes of the Delaware were the Mohicans. So not the Mohawks. The Mohawks are the Iroquois, but the Delaware, the Mohicans are the Delaware. And they had for centuries been rivals, the two great tribes. So you've got these two great rivals, the leaders of all the Indians. And finally, after centuries of warfare, they come together and they meet. And the Iroquois have this very long-term game, this trick. And they say to the Delaware, look, we've been fighting each other for centuries. It's clear that we're equal as warriors. But you have always had the superior position in terms of wisdom. And your learning and cultivation, and of all the Indian tribes, the Delaware were the only one that had any written language at all that we know of. So this is that's true. This is part of the mythology, though, that Cooper makes up. And so they say, you have this wisdom, and so what we should do is become one tribe, and we'll be the warriors of that tribe, and you be the wise men of that tribe. And the Delaware foolishly accept this agreement. And so all of these men age like Chingachgook. And at the point that they've reached, say, their late 30s, when they're no longer in their prime, all of the young warriors of the Iroquois turn on the Delaware and massacre them all. And that's why there are only two Mohicans left, Uncas and Chingachgook. And they have okay, so I'll tell you a little bit more too. You guys remember the cave? Okay. The cave was the sacred spot. It was the origin spot of the Mohican Indians. And it had sheltered them from harm for centuries. Nobody knew about it. Natty becomes a member of the tribe, so he knows about it. But when they take these guys in the novel, they're betraying their own remnants and their own tribe, because for the first time now, the Iroquois know where their hidden spot is, and they know their origin. So they've invaded both a sacred and a highly strategic spot. And so that scene in the cave, which actually they do it pretty well in the movie, but that scene in the cave is the critical moment, because the last of the Mohicans are willing to give everything they have for the American to survive. And the final scene of the last of the Mohicans, after Uncas is dead, is Chingachgook and Natty standing on a mountain, basically spreading the ashes of Uncas. And Chingachgook laments, "I am now the last of the Mohicans." And Natty says, "No, I'm your brother as well. I too remain." And the imagery, which Cooper is definitely not subtle about, the imagery is that the Americans are the new Indians, that the Mohicans have sacrificed all of this so that we could build the Republic. So they're good Indians, not bad Indians. They're very good Indians. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's the larger mythology behind all of this. And that's why the Iroquois are the bad guys. So, good. Thanks for asking. So now that I say it out loud, it seems more important than it did when I was just thinking about it in lecture. So, yeah, it's good. Okay, anything else? You guys might be scared after that long answer. Anything you ask, you'll get an equally long answer. If you can't tell, I like this novel a lot. It's a great novel, and it's one I think every American should read at some point. Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
How much has the movie changed in the book, and then why?
So one of the things that the movie tries to do, so there are 4 versions of that movie, all based on the same script. I think the first movie was made in 1936, and they used the same script for all 4 of the movies, including the one we watched the bit of. What they were trying to do in the 30s, when they rewrote it, was they wanted to, rather than having Natty be a scout for the British, they make him much more on the American colonial side. And it's actually kind of an anti-British movie, because the British come across as basically the kinds of things you would expect from the British during the Revolution, they're doing during the French and Indian War. So their behavior is a little bit, it's not quite historically accurate. They're willing to sacrifice the colonies, they're willing to sacrifice the colonials. And so in the movie, they really play up the tension between the American colonists and the British. In the novels, there's that tension, but it's mostly the tension because Natty wants to serve as a scout, but he doesn't want to be anyone's puppet. So the tension comes more from his individualism than it does from his Americanism. But in the movies, it's definitely very American. And the man who made that movie, Michael Mann, you guys probably aren't that familiar with him, but in the 1980s, he was famous because he created a TV show called Miami Vice. It was an actually very innovative TV show, very gritty for its time, and that's one of Michael Mann's characteristics, is that he loves showing tension in his films. So they put the tension in the movie between Hayward, really strongly between Hayward and Natty. That's not as strong in the novel. They're pretty good friends, actually. Overall, Hayward's problem is not that he's British, it's that he's a Southern slave owner. But they changed that for the movie. But the whole plot is reversed. So the novel, everything happens in the reverse of how it happens in the movie. So they've changed that. It's the same story, but they've reversed the plot in it. But yeah, it's pretty. I would recommend seeing that movie as well, especially if you have a good sound system. And that movie that has an excellent soundtrack, just wonderful. So good. Okay, anything else? All right. Well, I'm going to switch gears then. Thanks for letting me talk about all that. Great stuff to my mind. I'm going to switch gears to another topic, and that is the topic of who are we as an American? Basically going off what Cooper is asking, but asking it in a more direct sense in terms of trying to figure out what we are as an American people. So when we think about America and what is the American, we have a number of different ways that we can approach this. But the way that most people approached it at the time of James Fenimore Cooper and before was that somehow the American was this new being that no one had ever really seen before. And that feels a little different from the kind of Hillsdale story that we tell, in which we're trying to tell the story of America as being the result of the classical world, right? Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman tradition. But at the time of Cooper and before, many people were much more interested in the newness of the American. And even within conservatism today, you still see that to a slight degree. For the broadbacks and for me, not for you guys, but during the Reagan era, especially, Reagan very famously said, it's always morning in America. And that's that kind of new understanding of who and what we are. But Crevecoeur is one of the most famous of all analysts of America, writes, as I have here on the board, this new man, this strange mixture of blood, which you find in no other country. Here, individuals of all nations are melted into a new race of men whose labors and posterity will one day cause great changes in the world. He leaves behind him all that his ancient prejudices and manners. He receives new ones from the new mode that he has embraced, and the government he obeys, and the new rank that he holds. That's a very common understanding of what the frontier did, that it didn't just remake us, but actually gave us kind of rebirth, and we started over again. And so think about what we do. We leave behind all these ancient prejudices and these manners, and we can start anew. We can do this all over again, and we can get it right this time. And that's that Edenic Republican myth, that idea that we can start over as often as we need to. So when we look at American population overall, one of the things, and this is somewhat shocking when you start realizing the implications of it, but America has doubled her population every 22 years. So since the founding of the first colonies, every 22 years, America doubles her population. That's astounding, especially if you think about right now, we're at 333 million people in America. I mean, just imagine where we're going to be 22 years from now, right? That if those trends continue. But most of this, and what's fascinating, that most of what we see in the early period of American history is not immigration, though there is a lot of immigration. But it is actually a natural birth process that I'll get into here in just a moment. For us, on the verge of the French-Indian War, we are in the middle of it. We had a population of 1.5, 1.6 million. By the time we get to 1770, right on the edge of the American Revolution, we have 2.148 million people in America, and that includes blacks. That's whites as well as blacks. And you can see there the population is actually doubling every 22 years, or every 20-some years, it's doubling. So we're seeing a lot of natural growth. For us, and this is where we get the Hillsdale story, I think really we do it really well as a college. Now we get the story of who actually settles the Americas. And we have 5 groups of people that really make up the American population. We have the Puritans from New England. We have the Anglicans who settled in Virginia, the Quakers in Pennsylvania, the Scotch-Irish who settled throughout the Appalachians, and then, of course, the one totally unfree people who come over here, the Africans, completely against their will. Mostly from the East and West Coast. Actually, it's almost exclusively from the West Coast of Africa, coming between 1619 and 1808. There was some migration of Africans after 1808, but 1808 was the last year in which it was legal to import slaves into the United States. Predominantly, of course, that slavery is centered in the American South. But all of these peoples who come, these 4 great migratory groups that we see, 5 when we include the Africans, and I don't call them great only because they don't choose to come. It's still a great migration in the sense of it being a very powerful and affecting who we are as a people, but it's not something that they chose. But when we look at the Puritans and the Anglicans, the Quakers, and the Scotch-Irish, they each have distinctive characteristics that allow them to be something that others are not. So the Puritans are very, very community-oriented. Community is everything for the Puritans. And you may remember that from your American Heritage class, where the Puritans and their laws were always about the strengthening of community, making sure that there was always kind of a good birth rate, that families were increasing, that families were protected. The Anglicans were very concerned with hierarchy. Like the Anglicans that we see in Virginia, they're very concerned with hierarchy. They too love family. But unlike the Puritans, whose family pretty much resembles what a non-divorced normal family in America would look like now, mother, father, kids, for the Anglicans in Virginia, it was a patriarchy. where you have the oldest male in the family who is in charge of almost everything underneath him. And certainly women don't have near the rights in a place like Virginia that they do in New England. In New England looks downright feminist when you look at how democratic it is in terms of allowing women to participate in community. That was not the case in Anglican Virginia, where you have hierarchies everywhere. And women, and I guess maybe you remember this, remember the secret diary of William Byrd, that R-rated document you had to read in American Heritage? Right? And that was the norm for what we see among the elites in places like Virginia. And then you have the Quakers. Quakers who are most defined by their love of religious liberty, which means that they're going to be outcompeted by their opponents very quickly in Pennsylvania. So the Quakers are able to establish the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but very quickly they'll be overrun by the Baptists and the Methodists. And 100 years after the Quakers have arrived, they're kind of a minor people, which is crazy demographically, but simply the way, because of the freedom that they allowed of religion, they got outcompeted in that freedom. And then we have the Scotch-Irish, which, like what we see in Virginia, is very male-oriented as a society, but it's extremely egalitarian, unlike in Virginia. So you've got a violent society, very male society, a society that is concerned about hunting, concerned about fishing. These are the most important things you can do as a man. Different ways, someone like Andrew Jackson will come out of this, different ways of thinking about society. And then, of course, we bring in the unfree peoples, the Africans. And there we have also incredible contributions to what the American character is, mostly predominantly in the South. So what do we know about the demographics of final immigration right up until the American founding? And again, I apologize because if you guys take American founding with me next semester, you'll get this slide again. And in fact, you'll get all these slides again as we'll talk about what makes the American. But we have great statistics right before the American Revolution. Some of our best statistics come from that period right after the French and Indian War, leading up to 1775. And notice in that short time span, 125,000 people come from the British Isles. That's great. That, just for a moment, think about the logistics of that. In a time span of 12 years, 125,000 people come over. These are on wooden ships. Can you just imagine the logistical nightmare of moving this many people? I mean, this is a huge outmigration of Europe. And we see another 12,000 come from Germany and Switzerland, and during that same time, 84,000 slaves are imported. So we end up with that total, right about 250,000 people on the edge of the American Revolution. So 1775, right? That's pretty amazing. These people represent about 10% of the American people. So we have a huge demographic shift just in those years leading right up to the American Revolution. This is a decent map. It's not a great map, but it's a decent map where you can see in the north where certain populations are. The English, of course, are going to predominate, and the English here, almost all of the English who settle in New England, for example, it's always kind of a fun trivia point. Almost all of them were the English who came to England after the Danish invasion of England. So they almost all come from East Anglia, almost all the Puritans. You don't have Puritans coming from Oxfordshire. They come from East Anglia, so they were the Danes originally, and that's why you still have a lot of Scandinavian blood within the English who settle in New England. That's going to be very different from the people who settle in Virginia, the people like the Washingtons and the Lees and the Custuses, who are mostly from Oxford and the area around Oxford, and from London, from Wessex, and a couple of other counties. But they're all labeled English, but they're different kinds of English, as we see here. And then you see some other, even some Highland Scots, which means they're Catholic. It's pretty wild to think about some Catholic Scots immigrating to America. Just not something you normally expect, but quite a bit of diversity. And German, Dutch, French. So there are a number of different people. And notice, you can see here, most migration, of course, and most settlement is going to be along rivers. So it's either along the coast or it's along rivers. So that by the time we get to 1763, at the end of the French and Indian War, almost all American migration is still hugging the Atlantic coastline. The line that we call it is the fall line. The fall line is the line in the Appalachian Mountains where the water either flows to the west or it flows to the east. And if it flows to the east, then we're on this side of the fall line, and it means that you can have river transportation. And yeah, pretty amazing to think about that we're just hugging that coastline, which is another reason someone like Thomas Jefferson predicted it would take so very long to get all the way to St. Louis. And then we look at the South. Again, predominantly English, but we also have a lot of Scotch-Irish who've settled in the highlands. And they're going to be two different groups. You've got the people who are from upcountry and people who are low country. But notice too, we've got all kinds of Africans that are interspersed, not everywhere, but it's not, for example, the Scotch-Irish hardly own any Africans. That's fascinating in and of itself. Almost always it's the Anglicans who own the Africans, those who come out of that tradition of Oxford, and again, the Washingtons, the Lees, and the Custuses coming out of that. But still Germans, Dutch, more Highland Scots. It's not something we really think about, and French, of course. And then we've even got in the South, places like Savannah and Charleston, large Jewish communities in both of those places. So real diversity here. Michael?
Was New Bern a Swiss settlement?
Yeah, it's a Swiss, or it's a French and a Swiss settlement. Yeah, even if you think about the name too,
Yeah.
right? New Bern, pretty amazing. Yeah. Okay, so what do we know? Oh yeah, please.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Sorry.
Not
Is
at
there
all.
a reason that Protestant
Do you want me to go back?
Irish were, well, it was from a few slides ago, but was
Sure.
there a reason that Protestant Irish were immigrating more during this period, and
Yes.
that later on in the early 1800s it was much more Catholic Irish?
Yeah, Catholics don't, so there are no Catholic groups to speak of that matter in terms of Catholics who are actually settling in large areas outside of Maryland, and there are only a few Catholic families. Almost everyone who settles from Ireland is originally from Scotland, and they're almost always Presbyterian of some form. So there's no real Catholic migration to America until 1846. That's the first year we'll see large numbers of Catholics showing up. There had been Irish Catholics showing up in Boston throughout the 20s and the 30s, but never enough to change the demographics of Boston. But Boston amazingly goes in, and I may not have this exactly right, but I think I do. So if you quote me, just remember I'm putting this in quotes, but if I remember correctly, Boston goes majority Protestant to majority Catholic in 2 years. So 1846 to 1848 is the change, and that's all that Irish immigration that comes in, right? And that's a huge, I mean, you can imagine, this is old New England, and suddenly it's predominantly Catholic. That's amazing to think about that. So does that answer you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So one of the things that I say this as a practicing Roman Catholic, it's never the best thing to say, but it's true. There's no Catholic presence to speak of until 1846, which means that the entire founding is a Protestant endeavor. There are Catholics involved, but it's definitely a Protestant majority. 99.9% of the people are Protestant. So, yeah. Good. Who else did it? Ethan? Yeah.
I had a question about the German immigration. Like, which states were the most common for people to immigrate out of?
Mostly from central Germany, so
Okay.
places like Hesse, they're coming from. And the Hessians were hated because a lot of them fought on the side of the British during the Revolutionary War. But yeah, mostly Lutherans who are coming over. You don't get Catholic Germans until 1847, 1848. Then you'll see almost even Lutheran and Catholic will come over. But up to that point, it's mostly from the central Protestant states, rather than from places like Bavaria later on. Yeah. Good. Anybody else on this? Thanks. Great questions. Okay. So what do we know? We know quite a bit about this final migration. We know more about it than we know about any of the other migrations. So, for example, if you look up when the Puritans came, they'll say anywhere from 20 to 30,000 came. That's a huge discrepancy, 20 to 30,000. We just don't know. Was it 20 or was it 30? We have no idea. But now we actually get great documentation, first time ever in American history, of this migration leading up to 12 years prior to the American Revolution. So what do we find? Almost half are under age 25. These are people your age. Right? These are people who are coming over. About a fourth are between 20 and 25. 3/4 are male. That's wild in and of itself. That's starting to sound like Hillsdale's freshman class. Right? Or is it the opposite this year? I can never remember. Is it more male or female this year? It's more female, okay. So, but not by 3/4, of course, I'm exaggerating. But 3/4 are male. Half of them, 1/2, had sold themselves into servitude. 1/2. To get over here, they sell themselves for 7 years in servitude. Only about 1/3 travel in family groups, and 1/4 of them come from the city of London. That's just amazing to think about that. And to imagine these are the people on the edge of the American Revolution. These are the people who are going to be fighting. They're going to be the people who are fighting on both sides. And they're a part of this. And as I hope you guys know, during the Revolution, we'll do more of this next semester, but during the Revolution, you get about 1/4 of the people are entirely on the side of the Revolution, and about 1/4 of the people are completely against the American Revolution, and then the 50% in between shifts depending on where troops are and what's going on at the moment. But it's really only about 25% on either end. Some people even argue it's only 10% on either end, with 80% in the middle, but somewhere in there. Again, think about these guesses we have to make. We really don't have great knowledge about a lot of this, and yet we are able to figure out things like this. So this tells us a lot about who's coming to America. Alex?
So of all of these different statistics, does that mean that they, the third that traveled in family groups, it could also be some of them were indentured servant?
Yeah, they could have sold themselves as a family into indentured servitude. It seems to be the case here, since we're talking 3/4 are male. This is such a male immigration that's going on at that point. They probably were not part of the family groups, so they're probably the ones. But again, if half are indentured, then that's a huge number of people who are coming over and selling themselves. Now, I want you to keep this in mind as well. Indentured servitude is a form of slavery, but it's voluntary slavery that ends after 6 or 7 years. So when Africans are first brought over in 1619, they are not brought over as permanent slaves. They too are brought over as indentured servants and are freed after their 6 or 7 years. But that ends around 1669. Again, we have no idea as historians why. We just know that suddenly no one's releasing their slaves at the end, or their indentured servants, that is, their black ones, at the end of 1669. And then slavery, as we know it, begins around that time period. Nolan?
So I mean, if you see a quarter of the 125,000 people coming from London,
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess maybe we don't talk about enough. Why?
Yeah.
What was so bad
Yeah.
about London? And
They're always push and pull factors,
Yeah.
right? And I wonder if they actually were from London, or maybe they departed from London,
Yeah.
and so there are probably records where there's a lot of mix up of whether they're actually from London or just happened to transport from London. I would guess that's always a problem.
or really just and not even just London, but just the mass migration, in
Yeah.
general,
Well, it creates the modern world. Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, think about this. I mean, just let's imagine for a moment, and we're playing fantasy here for a second, but imagine we had a satellite that really could last over time and see things, and we were given the view of 1500, right? What the world looked like in 1500. Not one of us in this room, most likely, unless we just got wildly lucky, would guess that Europe would be the power that would take over the world at that point. It would look absolutely like China would be the main superpower of the world for the next 500 years. And yet China goes into isolation. It's wild. Right? There's no reason for it. They just do. They go into isolation. They have their period of huge expansion in the 1400s. They're settling the coast of Africa. They're exploring all throughout India. They're Chinese all across the Pacific exploring things. And then an emperor comes in and shuts it all down. Says, no, we're going to only focus on Chinese culture from here on out. Destroys the Navy. I mean, you would never have predicted that. And yet, what happens? We see essentially the old world, that is the old European world, move to the new world. Just thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people just moving. And no coordination to it. Right? It's all basically, especially in the English, you want to come? Well, how do you come? Well, I have to sell myself into servitude for 7 years. I mean, just think about that for a moment. Imagine getting out of college and your first job is indentured servitude, and you are absolutely bound to work for somebody for 7 years as their slave. That's a huge sacrifice to make. Right? It's absolutely huge. And that's what thousands of people are doing. So, I mean, your question is excellent. And I don't have an exact answer for it. They're push and pull factors. So whenever you're looking at demographics, they're always push and pull. So there are certain things people want to get out of London. They just don't want to be in London. But there are certain things in New York that they want. So it's not always that they hate London. It's more that they see their opportunity in New York is much greater. And so they're willing to take that chance. In the same way, I mean, think about, you're all going to graduate, and you'll disperse to all parts of the world. All of you will. Right? None of you are going to stay centralized in one area. A few of you might get hired on by the college, and you'll stick around. But most of you will just disperse. Right? And we all do that. I don't live anywhere near where I'm from. It's a 16-hour drive back to my hometown. And that's where the opportunity was. Is Hillsdale's not in Kansas. so here we are. But I mean, I feel like I'm sounding like I'm making light of this. No, and I'm not. I mean, these are always individual, complicated decisions, and especially when we're talking about mass numbers like this, it's really hard to say. But obviously, London didn't have a lot going for it, and the New World did. So that's one way. I mean, people are voting with their feet, even if they have to sell themselves into slavery for years. I mean, to get away with it. Yeah, Michael.
What happened to that population of Africans between 1619 and 1669
Yeah.
that were free from indentured servitude? What did they do?
That were not free, right?
So the ones who
were the ones that were free. They formed free black communities. So that by the time you get to the Civil War, there are 4.25 million blacks in the United States, and 0.25 million of those are free blacks in the South. So they have free black communities that are often right next to enslaved black communities, but there are quite a few free black communities as well, and they have to be very careful, and there are huge restrictions on them, extremely huge restrictions.
Right.
But yeah, that's where the free black population comes from.
And they stay in the South?
Mm-hmm. Some depart, they go to Canada, but for the most part, they stay in the South. I really recommend, if any of you ever get a chance, there's a great African-American writer from the 1920s through the 50s, a woman by the name of Zora Neale Hurston, who writes about this, what life was like. She's got a book called Dust Tracks in the Road about what life was like in these free black communities. And they're pretty amazing. Yeah. So, yes.
Were there many
Shelby.
indentured servants in England at this time too, or were people more likely to just sell themselves in order to get to the free
they're
world?
selling themselves for passage. So it's not nearly the kind of, in England you've got the class structure, and there are already people who are in that kind of servant class structure. But in America, they're doing that to trade for passage. That's how they're paying for their way over here. Yeah, good question. Okay, so this is where it gets really shocking and really wild. Very famously, in the second quote, a member of Congress said, "I invite you to go to the West and visit one of our log cabins and number its inmates, and there you will find a strong, stout youth of 18 and his better half just commencing the first struggles of independent life. 30 years from that time, visit them again, and instead of 2, you will find the same family, 22. This is the American multiplication table. And I can't stress this enough. Nothing in the world has ever been comparable to this. There is no population increase anywhere, anytime, that has equaled the American population increase from roughly 1620 up until about 1870. So we had almost 200 years of the highest fertility and birth rates the world has ever seen. So my undergrad advisor at Notre Dame was Walter Nugent. In one of his most famous books, 1981, he writes, Fertility was enormously high as long as the young people could form their own households on their own land. The American and Canadian census manuscripts are crowded with cases of women marrying at 16 or 17, producing a child every 18 to 24 months, about the biological maximum, because of breastfeeding and pregnancy intervals, until reaching menopause in their mid-40s. Newly married women could look forward to 20 or even 30 fertile years. Now, just do some quick math for a moment. If you're 16 and you get pregnant, you go 9 months, you have the baby, you breastfeed for 9 months, and then suddenly you can become pregnant again. And don't get me wrong, you can get pregnant during the breastfeeding as well. It's just not that likely. So if you take Nugent seriously about this, it means that the average woman getting married at 16 or 17 and then not experiencing menopause until, say, 44, 45, it means that they are having, on average on the frontier, 13 live births per woman. That's incredible. No one in the world has ever seen anything like this. Hillsdale comes close. But really, I mean, even we, well, maybe the Schleiters would think they could be part of this. But even, I think they're slackers, right? They're only at 11 or something. I mean, 13 is the norm on the frontier. And it's not like Americans are procreating more than other people. It's not like basically in America we're just having lots of sex. It's that we have extremely high nutrition rates. And people survive birth much longer, and there are fewer miscarriages going on. So there are massive changes in the way people are behaving and what they're eating. We have diary entries of farmers who talk about how they had steak for breakfast, steak for lunch, steak for dinner, and steak before bedtime. Can you imagine that caloric intake? What we would look like if we weren't farming and we were eating like that? They're using it all. They're burning this up. Ethan.
So is there less like infant mortality rates, or is it pretty comparable to what's going on in Europe?
Yeah, okay, so infant mortality now is the lowest it's ever been.
Yeah.
I mean, if you don't include abortion, obviously, but it's the lowest it's ever been. It was the lowest it had ever been as well 150 years ago, but it was extremely high compared to what it is now. So, but it was better than it ever had been. So infant mortality goes down. What happens, and I mentioned this to you guys a few weeks ago, you always judge by, can you make it to birth? Got a 50-50 chance. Do you make it to age 2? 50-50 chance. Do you make it to age 15? 50-50 chance. Do you make it to age 30? 50-50 chance. And then once you make it to 30, usually you're going to be okay. Probably end up having a good 70, 80 years of life. But those are the demographic statistics up until the modern world. So the rates of nutrition are better in places like Southern Europe than Northern Europe until the Columbian Exchange. But it's a dicey thing. It's a really dicey thing. I mean, we take, I read about these people who have home births all the time. I mean, that's amazing. That you have that much confidence in your birth that you have your baby in your bathtub at home. I mean, that's incredible. And that's something that never, that's all these people did have were home births, but it was completely unsanitary as well. So it's a different world, Ethan. Yeah. Alex.
I was just going to ask about like the infant mortality rates as well.
Yeah. So again, they're the lowest the world has ever seen, but they're far higher than now. All right, and then I'm sorry, guys. Oh, Bill, please.
What was life expectancy when men were giving up 7 years of their life?
It was still, it's always been pretty steady. If you make those benchmarks, it's usually about 70 years. And that's true, I mean, even when you go back and look at Scripture and the Old Testament, it talks about the 70 years that were given. And so you see that a lot, and that's kind of a constant throughout history. Most people live to about 70. So the fact now, of course, that the average age for males, death age, is so much higher than it's been. And it's interesting to think, Bill, you and I have such a better chance of good health longer in life than our fathers. I mean, even close. I mean, we are in such a better state on average. Anything can happen, of course, but on average, we're in such better health. And that's just been steadily improving since 1800. Every year it gets better. So it's one of the great just miracles of the modern world. Just amazing. So, yeah. Okay, I have to, one of my favorite Simpsons episodes. I love Cletus. So I had to, this is where we get 13 children per woman. This is the largest population explosion in the history of the world, to see these women giving birth to that many people on the frontier. So I think there's actually more than 13 there. But you guys know the Simpsons? You know Cletus? No? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm dating myself. But it's such a great, Cletus is the great, he's the poor Catholic, right? All right, good. So last thing, we'll call it a day. We don't have a lot of urbanization in America. Most people are moving to the frontier, and especially family groups move to the frontier, at least prior to the American Revolution. So urbanization, there are only 28,000 people in a place like Philadelphia in 1770, and that's the largest city in America. 28,000, and that would be a small suburb of Chicago now, at best. That was the most populated city in America. New York won't become the great metropolis it is now until about the 1830s. It will stay always in second or third place up until about the 1830s. And then with all the immigration that starts in the 30s, and especially in the 40s, it really booms and it easily overtakes the other cities. But there'll be a rivalry there for about the first 50 years of American history, especially between Philadelphia and New York. But Boston, Charleston, Newport, all of these places. Newport, fifth largest city with only 9,000. That's about the size of Hillsdale. Right? Hillsdale and Jonesville combined is about that. So that would have been a major city during America in 1770. Okay, any final questions from anyone? Thanks for, I know it's a little warm in here. Ethan, please.
How do these compare to like their European counterparts in say like London or like Madrid or?
Yeah, London. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up. I think anything that I told you would just be a guess. Okay. So I'd have to look that up.
But this by the time would be seen as still decently small, like by comparison.
Well, London would have been huge by European standards at that time, but I don't know what that hugeness was. So yeah, good. All right, thanks everybody. I'll see you on Thursday.